Hello. So retrieval practice is all about the exercise of retrieving prior knowledge. So it's not about teaching or learning any new content to students, but how we exercise their brains to gain long-term retention. And I remember when I first read about retrieval practice, the idea really dawned on me that, of course, learning is not only the process of imparting knowledge from teacher to pupil, but the other part of learning is them being able to relay that information, whether that be on an exam paper, writing an essay, or verbally in conversation. If they can't relay the information back to us, then they haven't properly learnt it, no matter how brilliantly we modelled and planned the learning from us to them. We need to allow time for them to remember and relay to us. But as well as that two-way learning process, retrieval practice is often used with clever spacing or interleaving in our curriculums to interrupt the forgetting process at optimum time points after the content is first taught. So you can see from the first diagram, which is a very simple representation of the forgetting curve, that over time content would generally be forgotten very quickly at first, and then it would slow to some level of knowledge, but nearing a very small amount. However, the second graph shows what happens and what difference it makes to the level of information retained by pupils if we revisit the content again and again and again with space in between, so that eventually the amount of information retained stays much higher than if we had not ever retrieved information at regular intervals. So other benefits, I think, that retrieval practice is meant to have is that it should engage all students. If they recognise something about what you're asking them, then maybe they're more likely to have a go. Retrieval tasks also lend themselves to assessment, depending on the type of task you use. But if you're choosing to retrieve some knowledge that they then need to use in the next bit of new content, then you are obviously going to want to assess whether they're ready or how much they've remembered, or whether some skills need reteaching before you can do the next bit. Some challenges for us to consider when facilitating retrieval practice, though. Students need to be thinking and using their brain to build schema in their brains and make learning longer lasting. And while engagement might be easier for some, others, of course, are going to need encouragement, perhaps with more scaffolding than others. But forcing all pupils to think by providing a question or a task rather than just asking a volunteer to share what they remember about some previous knowledge is definitely more effective at getting everybody to engage and be thinking. Another challenge, of course, is that retrieval practice takes up lesson time and it's not moving forward in new content, which can potentially make teachers feel frustrated or perhaps feel that it's unnecessary at certain times of the year. Potentially that's your feelings based on your school's curriculum design might affect that maybe. But I'm going to run through some of the retrieval practice techniques that I've seen teachers use or that I've tried myself. Starters are a classic way to embed retrieval practice. In the middle, you can see a simple 5QQ, 5 quick questions. In the middle, Kate Jones tweeted her retrieval pyramid on the left, and Retrieve Learn shared this grid of questions on their blog. And I wonder whether these sorts of starters look familiar or would look familiar to the pupils that you teach from your own lessons. Multiple choice questions provide a great opportunity for pupils to second guess themselves, particularly if you include some answers that seem correct at first, but actually have a subtle error in them and pick up on a misconception perhaps. I've seen really rich group discussions, and I remember one particular lesson I observed where there was actually no correct answer that available to choose from, and so pupils eventually built up the strength in their argument to explain why not. I think it's really important to vary the question style of these multiple choice questions as well, so that they don't become a quick quiz or perhaps too simple for some students to decide on. For example, you could ask, which of these is the best explanation? So there has to be, a different sort of thinking behind that kind of question. Or which of these is wrong? To get pupils thinking properly each time and have a different format to have to think about. And multiple choice questions, of course, can be used with whatever classroom routines you already have down. So it could be mini whiteboards on a Google form, on Socrative. You can use whatever routine you are most comfortable with. Something we've reintroduced this year at my school is the idea of pause lessons. So you can see a quick example listed on the screen as to how you would teach a topic, perhaps taking about 6 lessons, then do a pause lesson on a completely different previous topic. Perhaps you would choose the most helpful topic or a hinge skill that's most useful for other learning in your subject, or perhaps the topic would be chosen based on the need of your group. Maybe they've done a recent assessment and that has identified something that they need to go back to and have some reteaching on. Or perhaps you have a schedule, a bit like the screenshot shown, a schedule of topics spaced out evenly over time to have that regular retrieval and to interrupt that forgetting curve that we saw earlier. Flashcards are great because they allow for lots of repetition, and they can also be physically stacked into piles for each day, for example, or pupils could try and increase the number that they're able to go through each day. However, of course, they can only contain quizzable material like facts, quotes, equations, definitions, things like that. But something I've realised when watching pupils use them is that they must be double-sided. They need a question on one side and then the knowledge on the back. And while they are popular with pupils, I wonder how effectively most pupils are actually using them. I wonder whether I could measure the time that some students spend making the cards and making them look beautiful versus the time actually thinking hard while they're using them. Do students actually ask themselves questions, or are they just going through reading each fact? And if they are answering questions, then great. But do they sit with pen and paper to do any workings for them, or pen and paper just to commit their answers before they check? Should they do that? Or maybe that's not necessary. Are students always going through them in the same order? Do they always study them in the same room, the same location? And as teachers, do we allow time for creation of flashcards, effective flashcards in our lessons? Should we do that and allow time for their use in lessons as well, or not? But if pupils or some pupils are just reading them, that's ineffective. During remote learning, I'm sure we all saw the use of collaboration software like Padlet and other things like that increase. And it reminded me that when we pose a question for pupils to retrieve knowledge, it might be helpful for them all to contribute to something like this, a Padlet, where they can be prompting each other, really. And when pupils see something that a peer has written down, a piece of information might then come back to them, which they can then add, etc. And that reminds me, think, pair, share is, of course, something that could be used in retrieval activities and might benefit certain pupils, certain groups. And there are plenty more ideas, like the use of knowledge organisers, for example. But of course, these strategies can be implemented at varying levels of effectiveness. And I would love to hear what has worked well for pupils in your school. Thanks for watching.